Welcome back to Geography 321. We're going to finish our last lecture today on Brazil. Start off with a map here, and the first observation that we'll make is that Brazil is a giant country. So we looked at Mexico earlier in the semester in comparison to other Central American countries, which are very small by way of comparison. And when we look at South America here, we see that Brazil covers nearly half of the landmass. So it's a very influential country politically, economically, socially, and just in terms of its geographic size. Another observation that we can make is that it shares a border with nearly every South American country except for two, and those are Chile and Ecuador. What we're going to discuss today is the emergence of Brazil as a possible world power economically. We're going to discuss its potential, and we're going to discuss some of the things that may get in its way. We'll talk about this in the context of the World Cup that passed in 2014 and the upcoming Olympics in 2016. We'll also discuss favelas, or slums, in cities like Rio de Janeiro. We'll also discuss women in Brazil and their role in society as Brazilian society moves forward and the country develops very quickly. And then we'll wrap up by discussing the Belo Monte Dam in the Amazon rainforest and the kind of impact, both good and bad, that it may have on the country in the future. So Brazil is a huge country at 3.3 square million miles. The US is 3.7 square million miles by way of comparison. And I mentioned already before that it covers half of the South American continent and that it shares a border with all South American countries aside of Chile and Ecuador. And here you can see this map again. Another observation to make here is that a lot of the borders that it shares with other countries are Amazonian borders. They're in the middle of the rainforest. Brazil is the fifth largest country in the world, following China, India, the US, and Indonesia. And it has a population of almost 200 million people. And keep in mind that the entire population of the South American continent is 387 million people. And so in terms of the implications of that, as I mentioned already, it's just a very influential country. Another thing to take into our perspective is that we oftentimes think of South America as a Spanish-speaking country. And it's true that in the aggregate, the number of countries that speak Spanish obviously are far more than those who speak Portuguese. But in the case of South America as a whole and its population, it's actually a continent which is half Spanish-speaking and half Portuguese-speaking. When you look at Brazil's location and you look at its physical geography, you note that it is a country that is dominated by two landforms. One is that it has a coast that is over 4,000 miles long, so it's a very extensive Atlantic coastline. The other is that it's got large swaths of Amazonian rainforest. Within the coast and the rainforest, you find a tremendous base of natural resources, and you have to underscore this because this is where Brazil's potential as a possible economic superpower lies. Some of the resources that are contained within these environments include coffee, citrus, cattle. I put an asterisk by cattle because the cattle industry is huge in Brazil. It provides a lot of the beef that we eat in the United States, but it's also an industry that's associated with deforestation in the Amazon. But Brazil also produces sugarcane, gold, diamonds, oil, and natural gas, and these last two resources are perhaps the most important. They've discovered a tremendous amount of oil off the coast in Brazil just in the last 10 years. So there's a lot of potential there. When we look at urban areas that are important in Brazil, we should first look at Salvador da Bahia, which is a city that is the home to Afro-Brazilian traditions, and it was once the capital city of Brazil. It's an important city in terms of Brazil's cultural heritage. It's not the most populated. It's only got 2.6 million people, which in the context of a large country like this is not that many. Then we look at the current capital, which is Brasilia, which is 2.5 million. And Brasilia is a planned capital. That means that the capital was removed from where it once was, and it was placed in another location for some strategic reason. And in this case, Brazil did this because they were trying to protect, in part, their borders that are Amazonian with other countries. They felt that there was the possibility that those borders would be chipped away at over time. And then we look at larger cities in Brazil, such as Rio and Sao Paulo, at 6.3 and 11 million respectively. These are very influential cities. Rio is a city that most people associate Brazil with because of the beaches and the Christ the Redeemer, the statue, and the kind of soccer that you see being played on the beaches. And a lot of the cultural icons that they showed us during the World Cup came from Rio. Sao Paulo is a larger city and a very influential city with the business community, and it's got a very high population and a lot of population density as well. Brazil is a really diverse country, and it has an indigenous presence. It was a large population before the colonial period. We estimate that at about 10 million, but as is the story with every other region we've discussed, colonial disease severely reduced that population. Some of that indigenous population fled deeper into rainforests like the Amazon, and they tend to be smaller groups. There's not a huge population like there is in a place like Bolivia or Peru. They tend to be smaller groups that are distributed in points throughout the forest in the Amazon, and they don't have large numbers, but there are quite a few diverse groups. They are, like every other place we've discussed, marginalized in modern-day Brazilian society, however. They're very poor, and they occupy the lowest rung of the socioeconomic ladder. The Afro-Brazilian population is also significant, and it's a product of the transatlantic slave trade. About 4 million slaves were introduced during this period for the sugarcane industry, and African religion has become a part of mainstream Brazilian culture. There are aspects of it which pervade different parts of Brazilian society, and the influence of Afro-Brazilians in the artistic sense, or in the sense of the contributions that they've made to their culture, has been embraced in Brazil. Some people may even argue that it's the root of Brazilian culture. That said, there's a lot of racism in Brazil, and typically the darker the color of the skin, the lower on the socioeconomic ladder people stand. So there's a lot of racism. There's also a fairly sizable European population. Brazil was the Portuguese crown jewel, and after independence from Portugal, several million Europeans arrived, and these included people from Italy, Portugal, Spain, Russia, Germany, Switzerland, and England, and many of them settled in Sao Paulo. If you had to look at Brazil and describe it in a nutshell, you could say that it's a real mix of cultures, and while racism persists, there's also, in some cases, like in the case of Carnival and some of the celebrations, and in some ways you could argue in Brazilian society that diversity is recognized and celebrated even amidst the racism that exists. So it's kind of tenuous balance there in order to try to understand the culture. Now, we've mentioned that Brazil is an emerging financial power, and I have a list here of the largest economies in the world. They include the US, China, Japan, Germany, France, UK, and Brazil. So that's quite a list, and they have quite a potential to move into this century as a major power because of their tremendous natural resource base that we mentioned before. They are a BRIC nation. BRIC nations include Brazil, Russia, India, and China, and they are economies that are projected to be very powerful in the next century. Some pundits have said that they are the future of the world economy, but in the last few years, economic growth has slowed quite a bit, so there's a lot of potential there, but it's not a guarantee that it's going to be realized. Let's talk about this economic situation in the context of the World Cup. So many of you tuned in 2014 and saw the World Cup, and one of the things that was celebrated during the World Cup were these opulent stadiums. Some of them are pictured here below, and they were built in different parts of Brazil, and they drew huge international fandom, and a lot of people from all over the world visited Brazil and saw games. But there were also a lot of protests leading into the World Cup, so I want to discuss why that took place. Here's a map of Brazil, and the first thing that we can say is that a lot of these stadiums were built in and around big cities like Brasilia, Salvador, Rio. There was one built in Porto Alegre. There was also one built in Manaus. Manaus is right in the middle of the Amazon if you look at the northwest section of this corner of Brazil. And Manaus is, it's a rainforest city. It's an interesting city. You can't drive there. For example, you have to be on a plane or you have to go by riverboat. But there was some criticism of the Brazilian government for building really opulent stadiums in places like Manaus. FIFA, who awarded Brazil with the World Cup, had a responsibility matrix and an agreement with Brazil that it would spend $400 billion in public spending to update public infrastructure that includes roads, airports, transportation systems, and stadiums. This is part of their responsibility matrix, which requires that venue cities, once awarded the World Cup, agree to update services. What's taken place in Brazil, and one of the big reasons you're seeing so much protest going into the World Cup, and you might again coming up in the Olympics, is that progress has been slow with the Brazilian government. They haven't built the roads and the airports and the bridges as fast as they've built the stadiums. They've put a lot of energy into the stadiums, but the general public felt very let down for what they didn't build. Another question that was raised by the Brazilian public was what was to become of these stadiums in these very remote areas. They cost a lot of money to build, they're very opulent, but what do you do with a stadium like this after it's been built and the Olympics and the World Cup have passed? In general, they had to raise ticket prices in these stadiums, and the general public, whereas they're used to going to see league games in Brazil, and whereas they're used to going and cheering for their local team, many of them are now priced out of their stadium. So that hasn't gone over well. And generally, these stadiums in these faraway and remote places have been seen as somewhat of a waste of money. Then there was a lot of protest related to the pacification of favelas. The pacification of favelas was a move by the Brazilian government to go in and move people out of the favela or the slum. And leading up to the World Cup, 65,000 people in Rio alone were moved out of favelas. Favelas are a form of urban slum. They are oftentimes historically referred to as African slums because people from the northeast section of Brazil would move out of farming land that was not being productive or where they were suffering from drought, and they would move into these slums, and this was largely the Afro-Brazilian population. Now, slums we've discussed many times during the semester lack clean water and services and electricity, and they tend to be poor. They're also the epicenter of the drug trade in Brazil. And so the government made the argument that it needed to target the slums and the favelas to eradicate them of the drug trade. But we began to see pictures that came up in the media, and there were signs of Brazilian residents that were saying basically to police and to special forces, don't come into our favela, don't kill. And you see images such as the one on the bottom left side of the screen where guns are being pulled. And, the average Brazilian favela resident isn't living a life of crime. They're just trying to kind of live a life and make an income and scratch out some kind of existence. And yes, there are drug runners in the favelas, but a lot of the public was very upset with the way that the Brazilian government went in with force to remove them.